Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. This week we talk to the editor of Forbes Magazine, the one and only Steve Forbes, about some of the ideas being proposed by Democrats, and he offers some serious advice for President Trump to get the economy moving again. Check it out. And this is our podcast, Kibbe on Liberty. Thanks for joining me.
Good to be with you. Thank you. I like that word liberty these days.
Yeah. Well, it's a word that's not used enough, I suspect.
Or honored enough.
Honored enough, something like that. And I thought what we might do today is tap into your knowledge about basic economic principles and how they apply to politics. Everyone knows who you are. I'm not going to waste much time on that, but you're the editor-in-chief at Forbes Magazine, two-time presidential candidate, really the guy that figured out the flat tax and made it popular back when the Republican Party talked about tax reform. That's not really so much a thing anymore.
And part of the problem is they use the word tax reform, which means nothing to people. You say tax cuts and tax simplicity, people get it.
Yeah.
GOP's got a communications problem, among others.
Well, we'll get into the GOP, but there's such a target-rich environment, so few politicians, and I would include Republicans and Democrats in this. We don't really talk about policy anymore. We seem to spend a lot of time talking about sort of tribalism and us versus them and why the other guys are so bad, but we don't really talk about substance and policy. So I thought we might take a couple minutes and walk through some of the marquee proposals of the candidates running for president. And I suspect you have an opinion about some of these things.
Oh, I might, I think.
It's a little depressing to see how a lot of the ideas of Bernie Sanders have become sort of baseline popular proposals amongst almost everyone running for president as a Democrat today. And right now we're arguing about Elizabeth Warren, and she has proposed, let's start with Medicare for All. Medicare for All, which I guess is a euphemism for socialized medicine, government-owned medicine. It's not just government-controlled medicine anymore. Is Medicare for All a good idea?
Medicare for All is another way of saying less health care for the many. And the way other countries control health care costs is by rationing. You just don't get it or you wait for it. In Britain, for example, if you need kidney dialysis, you're above the age of 60 or 65, you will not get it. They will simply let you die. This country has always been based on the principle of turning scarcity into abundance. And when free markets are allowed to operate, that's what happens. Just take our handhelds. Virtual supercomputers in your hand. If you had said 20 years ago Grandma could operate a supercomputer, they'd have looked at you and saying, wonder if you've been in the sun too long. Now we take it for granted. Grandma can do it. That's the virtue of allowing creativity. And what we see here in terms of government control of health care, not only does it mean less, not only does it mean politicians deciding who gets it and who doesn't, but also kills innovation. Europe, for example, was once a great font of new medicines, new medical devices. They went more and more for government control, and as a result, they aren't creative as they once were. We are. They've fallen by the wayside. So it just doesn't mean waiting for health care. It also means you're not going to get things that we could have had.
So the price inflation in healthcare is a very real thing, and the cost of insurance since the implementation of Obamacare.
Yes, we're supposed to cut it by several thousand the last I heard. Yes.
Well, it doubled mine. I don't know about yours, but
it did it for everybody.
I'm paying out the nose for that.
And also the co-pays.
Yeah.
So the deductibles. So you may have the insurance, but you end up paying more than you did before.
It's as if every single promise under Obamacare has been broken
or turned upside down.
Yeah.
And the thing about healthcare is to recognize this is not free markets. This is all third party. There's a disconnect between providers and consumers. And it's Medicare, Medicaid mostly on the government part. Large insurance companies. the patient doesn't count. Now, nobody designed the system, so no point pointing fingers. It evolved in a very poor way. And you see it with hospitals. They know their revenue depends on how well they negotiate with insurance companies, how well they negotiate with Medicare, Medicaid, not on how they're serving the patient. So it's amazing we do as well as we do with this kind of contorted system. And I like to point out, to show where the patient stands in this pecking order, is that the lousiest motel in America wouldn't dare put you in a room with another guest, a sick guest with a curtain in between, as is routinely done in hospitals. So the key on that is to get real free markets. We have a little bit of that in food, which is more basic than health care. Government, I think, is still too much involved in agriculture, but at least the government doesn't try to run the farms. If they did, we'd have no more obesity. We'd all be starving. They tried it in China and Russia that way. It had some disastrous results. So let entrepreneurs have a free run in healthcare, have real markets in healthcare, and have safety nets. In food, if people can't get it, you have everything from food banks to food stamps. Why in the world can't we do the same thing in healthcare? Unleash that kind of creativity, give more control to the patients, and make sure people, if they come in rough times, they're not going to be thrown on the sidewalk.
It seems like Republicans aren't bold enough when they propose healthcare reforms, because they seem caught in this trap where they're defending the status quo, and it sounds like they're defending drug companies and they're defending insurance companies, and of course, these lobbyists swarm the Capitol and game the system, and we have a problem just explaining what a actual free market consumer-based system would actually look like, because everybody knows that costs are out through the roof. Everybody knows that even now there's a form of rationing. It's difficult sometimes to get the services you need for lots of patients, but we don't think bold enough. I shouldn't say we. I feel like legislators, and particularly Republicans who aren't proposing single payer happily, like they don't know what the vision is. Is that fair or not?
There's not been a good job. Good performance in explaining what free markets would look like in health care. What it would mean is you would control the resources, not some third party. That's the glories about health savings accounts. You control that money in your own account, not a Washington politician. If you get a better price on a drug, that's your money, not an employer's or an insurance company's or the government. And we need more of it. And there are various ways you can do it. Nationwide shopping for health insurance. Instead of these restricted markets, we're now in New York. If you want to buy a policy offered in Pennsylvania, it's illegal. You can buy a car in Pennsylvania, but you can't buy the insurance. Have a nationwide market. Equal tax treatment. If you're an individual, you pay with after-tax dollars. That's not fair. With others, get it with pre-tax dollars. Transparency. Have hospitals and clinics post prices. Have postings of infections received after you're admitted to a hospital. Have the Justice Department go after what they call cons, certificates of need. If Starbucks wants to set up a store next to Dunkin' Donuts, they just go and do it and see which one does better. They both may prosper. But in 36 states, you still have to get permission from the government if you want to expand an existing facility, start a new existing facility, which crushes innovation. No surprise. How about removing all these restrictions in health savings accounts, both with what you put in and what you can use them for? Right now, you can't use them for over-the-counter medicines. That's crazy. And so removing these obstacles to put you and more in charge, and technology's becoming to our rescue more and more, especially as 5G starts to get rolled out in the next few years. You're going to be able to measure things. You don't have to go to a doctor's office or a hospital. All these kinds of new drugs and medicines and medical devices coming along. So it's ripe for it. And because more and more companies are going for high deductible plans, many of the smart ones combine it with a health savings account. But even with Obamacare, the high deductibles there, you might have subsidies, but you still end up feeling you're getting restricted in terms of your choices and paying more out of pocket. Those are creating a consumer market. And you're going to see the kind of disruptions there that Lyft and Uber have done in taxis, Airbnb in the hotel industry, and so many other areas. It's starting to come to healthcare. and we should clear the obstacles so that patients are in charge. When patients are in charge, you don't have that disconnect between doctors and patients. By golly, we're going to get the best of all worlds, more for less.
Yeah. A lot of the barriers to competition you describe are, in fact, barriers that were lobbied for by industry groups and healthcare providers and insurance companies and drug companies. And I think we should be willing to call them out for that bad behavior. That's not free market. That's cronyism.
And how about taking a look at PBMs, pharmaceutical benefit managers? They're originally created to help consumers and organizations deal with bargain with pharmaceutical companies. Now they're a kingdom unto themselves. If you're a pharmaceutical company, and you don't appease the PBMs, your drug does not get to be available.
Yeah. One small, like there's mostly bad news on healthcare. Even attempts to repeal and replace Obamacare fell short. But one bright side that really captures that positive message about patients and doctors making choices without bureaucrats and regulators between those is the legislation President Trump signed for Right to Try. I feel like the story of allowing patients more control over their own lives, particularly patients who have been given a virtual death sentence, why would anyone oppose something like that?
Because it's all rules-based. And this goes back to the 60s, where the idea grew up: if you have enough rules and laws, you don't have to rely on human judgment. They'll cover every contingency, which is preposterous, but that's why you have these 500-page manuals telling teachers how to teach or discipline a student.
Yeah.
You learn pretty quickly if you're going to be any good in that job. You don't need a book to tell you how to do it. Experience will do it. And so, yes, these are steps in the right direction. But that's why, again, we got to do all we can to get this consumer market going.
Yeah.
And these things will happen on their own, like electronic records. Every drugstore, every laundromat, every gas station had electronic records 20 years ago. Why didn't it happen in healthcare? Because there was no competitive advantage in doing so. Now the government's trying to say, do it from the top. Here's what you must do.
Yeah.
Whereas in a free market, you'd have all different kinds of electronic record systems for all different kinds of specialties. It would have happened just by people doing it on their own.
So let's go back to Elizabeth Warren and her Medicare for All. And she has...
and by the way, the nasty little secret is these people who propose these things always have their own special health care benefits.
Yeah. The Congress is not going to suffer under Medicare for All.
No, sir.
But she says this is a good deal. It only costs $20.5 trillion, according to her. Even Bernie Sanders has thrown out a much bigger number with that. And objective third parties have said it's 30 trillion. It might be 40 trillion. It might be even more. I suspect they're all underestimating the total cost of this because, as Margaret Thatcher once said, the problem with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money. How much does this cost? And how would they ever raise that money?
Well, this is where you have to be a little careful. Don't lead with the fact that it's going to cost a lot of money, because what you lead with, it's going to mean less health care for you. You're not being able to decide what you might need for your child or your loved one.
Yeah.
Taking away, we already restricted enough, but this way bureaucrats are making those decisions. You should be able to make those decisions. You should have providers trying to find ways to make your life easier, make it more convenient to get these medicines and medical devices. And if people need help, there are very tried and true ways to make sure you're not left behind in terms of needed care. That's, again, the virtue of free markets will turn scarcity into abundance. And that's the way you attack it. In terms of the numbers, they're just so gargantuan, nobody can get their heads around them. And what she proposes how to, quote, pay for it after she destroys the system and makes it totally chaotic is by destroying the economy. The economy moves forward. Economy is people, and people move forward when you have investment. People starting businesses, expanding businesses, replacing obsolete equipment and the like, coming up with new products and services. That takes savings, and she would destroy savings, and so we'd have stagnation. And we've seen in other countries where that leads. Why do we want to do that here? Why does she ignore experience? So one can make a crack about her ethnicity in terms of her calculations and saying, oh, you won't pay any more. It'll be all free and glorious. Yes, right.
Yeah. I mean, she's only going to tax the wealthy. I mean, who's against that?
Well, she tries to play the envy card. Oh, all your woes are those evil people, like the head of Morgan Stanley, the head of J.P. Morgan, these hedge fund, blah, 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 blah. And so you pick out convenient scapegoats and say, by golly, if we get rid of them, if we crush them, all would be well. And aren't they so selfish for not giving more to her favorite causes and supporting her? And as Lincoln said, you don't help people move up by crushing the rich. You don't make people richer by crushing the rich. You make it possible for people without the means who are starting out the chance to rise up, as he put it, improve your lot in life. And that's what, so she's playing the demagogue card. And so you want to go to Venezuela, you want to go to Cuba, North Korea, and other paradises, and even the exalted systems overseas. There's some pretty good systems, but you don't have the innovation, and you do wait.
Back to your point about tax reform, I mean, the Democrats' envy card is always, we're going to tax those rich guys, we're not going to tax you. You know, in practice, it's the middle.
And this is where the Republicans have got to get their act together.
Yeah.
They talk about, how do you pay for the free stuff?
Yeah.
Nothing is free. Well, look at Europe. In this country, most states, some exceptions, have sales taxes, 5, 6, 7%. Some crazy place like Chicago is 10%. In Europe, they have a super sales tax called a value-added tax, 20 to 25%. So you buy something for $100, just add $25 to it to pay for your free stuff. Payroll taxes, what we call FICA, 15.3% in this country. Just keep 15% in mind. Comes off the top. In Europe, 35 to 50%. Their income tax rates are higher. That's how you get your free stuff.
Yeah. The counter argument that you made so well when you ran for president is that a very complex tax code that attempts to punish wealth creation, it attempts to sort of separate us based on income or industry or however they demonize that, it's ultimately not fair to those of us who don't have an army of lobbyists and lawyers to game the system, to rig it. And I feel like we should steal the fairness argument back from Democrats, because treating everybody the same used to be what meant fair.
Yes, and half the lobbying in Washington revolves around this monstrosity. So let's just go through the words, my favorite thing. Constitution, amendments, 7,200 words. Bible, took centuries to put together, 773,000 words. And the federal income tax code and all the attendant rules and regulations, not just the code itself, that's just the start. But you have different rulings, interpretations from Treasury and everything else, 10 million words and rising. And nobody knows what's in it. It's a travesty. Several years ago, a magazine did a survey. They took a hypothetical family's finances, numbers, gave them to 46 different tax preparers, people considered experts in the field. And you know what they got back? 46 different tax returns, 46 different estimates of what that family owed, all different, thousands of dollars of difference. This from people who make their living at the thing. So it brings out the worst in us. And you have to look at opportunity costs. This is something very important because we tend to get caught up in economics and sound like we're nerdy bookkeepers. What is happening here? The IRS tells us we spend 6 billion hours a year filling out tax forms. Experts tell us we spend $200 to $400 billion a year complying with this incomprehensible, corrupt monstrosity. Go back 20 years. Think of literally tens of billions of hours, hundreds of billions of hours. Literally trillions of dollars, all for this stupid code. Now imagine if all those resources had gone instead to new products, new services, new medical devices, new cures for diseases, how much better off we'd be, that opportunity cost, all that wasted brain power. We do it to ourselves. So let's liberate ourselves and have that time, that brain power, those resources go for something that benefits all of us.
So based on those principles, how do you rank the tax cuts that Republicans passed and President Trump signed into law, I guess 2 years ago now.
Yeah, in December of 2017. A nice step in the right direction. They could have done, even in their constricted way, much more. But one of the amazing things about Republicans is they worship this thing called the Congressional Budget Office, which purports to tell us what the impact of tax changes, spending changes will have for the next 10 years. If they knew what was going to happen in the next 10 days, they wouldn't be working at the CBO. They would be in the stock market, the commodities market, buying lottery tickets.
Yeah.
They don't know. But nonetheless, the Republicans take it very seriously. And when you program these models to assume that tax cuts don't do very much, then the tax cuts don't do very much. And so it's biased, the old GIGO thing, garbage in, garbage out. But the Republicans took it very seriously. Instead of, all right, those models are wrong, rewrite them or throw them out and just do it. And if they did, we'd have an even more prosperous economy today.
So Elizabeth Warren has a wealth tax, and she appears to have stolen this idea.
Wealth-destroying tax.
An economy-destroying tax for sure.
Yep.
Funny thing about wealthy people is that they're mobile, and they have ways to get around this, including just leaving.
Well, they have this sort of cartoon fantasy, these Elizabeth Warrens of the world, that people's wealth is like that old Disney character Scrooge McDuck, sitting in his money bin, swimming in all his coins and gold jewelry and bills and all that kind of thing. Their wealth is not liquid. It is not cash. Most of it's in the form of assets. And when you tax assets, you reduce the value of it. So you slam Bezos and Amazon. Suddenly he goes from 120 billion to 60 billion. Poof, just disappears. It's not physical.
Yeah.
You don't understand that. So by taxing assets, you destroy the value of assets. And so you end up with less savings. People use the word capital. I use the word capital. That's another word for savings. Whether it's you deferring, not spending all your income, companies making a profit, it's savings to finance existing businesses, new businesses, coming up with new ways. Most new things don't work, so you have to finance those in the marketplace. So it enables us to find out what works and give us a higher standard of living. And again, we all benefit from it. So in the name of helping us, she's going to destroy us. And the only people who will be helped are those who are commissars around her making those decisions. And they always seem to live very well helping we the people.
Yes, I've noticed that Nicolas Maduro is gaining weight as his country starves.
You would not use him in a Weight Watchers ad.
No, you would not at all. But of course, Elizabeth Warren is moderate compared to some of her colleagues on the presidential stage, and I think she stole a lot of these ideas from Bernie Sanders, who is actually a
There are no copyrights in politics.
Well, there's no property rights in socialism either, I guess. And
Good point.
so Bernie came out with something. It sounds great, economic Bill of Rights. And of course, his tax the rich scheme is in there. He wants to tax Wall Street. He wants to tax capital in particular, which seems somewhat ironic, given that he points to the Scandinavian countries as what he means. You know, when people accuse him of being a socialist, he's like, "No, I'm a democratic socialist, and I'm not talking about the USSR. I'm talking about Norway." And if you look at countries like Norway, other Scandinavian countries that Bernie celebrates, they actually treat capital pretty well.
You take the two biggies, Denmark and Sweden, which don't have the oil that gives a cushion to Norway and places like Kuwait. And they initially created their wealth relative to other countries with free market economics, low taxes, sensible regulation. And as they got more prosperous, they decided, hey, let's do all these freebies and more benefits, and why bother to work? And they got into serious economic trouble. And so they scaled back the very kinds of behaviors that Bernie Sanders wants to bring here to the United States. Sweden, for example, does not have a death tax. Sweden allows you school choice. Is that what Bernie Sanders is proposing? If so, I haven't heard it yet.
Yeah. If so, I'd sign up.
So they have their fantasy lands
Yeah.
that don't exist.
Yeah. The the other thing that he does, and he of course has also embraced Medicare for all, government ownership of the provision of medicine, is how I like to describe it. And he says his, by the way, costs a lot more than Elizabeth Warren's. But he takes it a step further, and this is the first time I think I've seen this proposal. He wants to forgive medical debt, and along with education debt. And I think about you've seen this data. You look at industries in the United States where price inflation is rampant, and two industries stick out: healthcare, and you mentioned perhaps the reason why even before Obamacare. The majority of a dollar spent on healthcare would come through Medicaid and Medicare and other government providers of
third
health.
parties, even if they're in a free enterprise system. It's not the traditional provider-consumer model.
So, and maybe I think this is counterintuitive to people that don't think like economists, but the more that the government throws money at something like healthcare, without competition, without accountability of all these third-party decision makers, you get less and less, but you can spend seemingly an infinite amount on really bad health care.
And you see it in higher education, the other area where costs are going up, sticker prices going up 4 times the rate of inflation, and all with good intentions.
Yeah.
Decades ago, hey, let's help kids by encouraging student loans. We'll guarantee the banks, give them grants like Pell Grants, will help them out pay these tuition costs. And unlike the traditional scholarship that colleges and universities had, where you were expected to work and get help from others, this became a way for universities and colleges to get money and jack up costs and build more facilities. You look at the rise, and this also is government regulation. You have huge administrative staffs, huge bureaucracies. You look at the growth of bureaucracies and mandates versus professors actually doing real research or teaching in the classroom. Boy, the lines diverged a long, long time ago. So you have all this bloat. If you want to see where decent management, where there's real accountability can work, just look at Purdue University. 7 years ago, a new president came in, former governor, former budget officer from Washington, Mitch Daniels. And they came to him and said, we've got to raise tuition as we always do every year, 3 to 4%. He said, well, I'm new here. We're going to freeze it a year. I just want to get my arms around this job before doing something like that. And the admissions office said, if you do that, if our price is seen as lower than other universities, people are going to think we have an inferior product. It'll hurt admissions. Now they come to him and say, don't raise the tuition. So for 7 years he froze tuition, not for 1 year, but for 7 years in a row. Cut deals with places like Amazon to make textbooks cheaper and the like, efficiencies in food services. And today, a kid going to Purdue will spend less overall than a kid going to Purdue 7 years ago.
Wow.
They've hired more professors, so it's not skimping on educational opportunities. So it goes to show where there's accountability and you have the traditional markets, consumerism working, by golly, you will get more for less. And that should be the model for higher education. But right now with these subsidies, they don't care if you take 6 years. They don't much care if you don't graduate and getting stuck with debt. So college, which was once seen as a road to mobility, really helping you advance your career, realizing the American dream, becomes a form of servitude because you end up with this debt that you spend years trying to pay off, and a lot of them are not going to be able to pay it off. So before even talking about what you do about existing debt and taking account of people who did pay their debts, you got to fix the problem. Otherwise, it's just going to come back again.
So you see like how young people who borrowed a lot of money to get a college degree and discovered in the process that it wasn't worth nearly as much as they thought it would, so they're burdened with all of this debt. And let's say they came to age around 2008 and they saw Washington, D.C. bail out Wall Street, and yet they have all of this debt.
We see Washington said to them, we're helping you. We're making it easier for you to go to college, and you don't have to worry about the cost.
Yeah.
Well, it was false advertising. And so again, watch what happens when they say we're here to help you out. Those banks that got bailed out, they suffered in the sense that, they may have gotten a bailout. Most of them, by the way, like Morgan and some others, BBT, did not want a bailout. They were fine. They did not want to have to put money up and suffer for the sins of their brethren. So, but even there, their opportunities were restricted. They're told not to lend, which hurt the economy. So all of these things are bad all around. But in terms of students, what you're going to see, and again, high tech is going to help if we give it a real push, is you can do your education on your own. You can do it online. Starbucks helps their baristas get an education, not through the traditional scholarship. The former head of the company, creator of it, a fellow named Schultz, Howard Schultz, said that's not going to work. We can't give baristas $20,000 to go to college. So they came up with an innovative online education courses with the Arizona State University. Worked it out with them. A very, very creative way to do it. So you can get that higher education, still earn money, and not end up with crushing debt. And what you're going to see more of is what business schools discovered years ago, is you can get to these schools like Wharton and Harvard and Northwestern and others, very nice degree, a certificate in a certain area with the business school imprimatur on it. But you take a course, 12 weeks, 16 weeks, 18 weeks, but you may only spend 1 or 2 weeks on campus. The rest is online. And so you're going to see more and more of that. Show us you're proficient in an area. If you want humanities, plenty of opportunity to go online to do it. So the traditional way of education is going to profoundly change. There's more than, use the cliche, there's more than one way to skin this cat.
Yeah. And the old idea of bricks and mortar education, particularly with the insane inflation that we have in all of this, it seems like it's ripe for disruption. And we talk a lot about that on this show, that technology and the ability to Google stuff is a radically disruptive.
Well, I'm old enough to remember a thing called card catalogs in libraries. You laboriously have to go through, and now you just go online, boom, boom, boom.
Finding ideas was an arduous process back then. You had to be super motivated in order to do that.
And by the way, in terms of reform, why does it take 4 years to get through undergraduate? Maybe you should be able to easily do it in 3 years.
Yeah.
You won't have the long summer vacation, but take 5 weeks off and do it in 3 years. Your parents will be happy. You'll be productive sooner, or at least have more time to figure out what you're going to do with your life.
Yeah.
And law school, most will tell you, whispers, you could do that in 2 years. And how about letting students once again do what they used to do if you want? Apprentice in a law office and still be allowed to take the bar.
I'm not sure the legal guild would allow for that. It's a cartel like all of these things.
Which gets to the whole subject of licensing, perhaps another subject for another time, of restricting.
Well, it should be something that young people care about. You're talking about a lot of freedoms that would particularly affect millennials and Generation Z, and yet back to this problem, like there's every year there's a new scare poll that shows that more and more young people are embracing socialism, and they embrace Bernie's philosophy, and they embrace Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax. How do we turn the ship there?
Well, part of the problem is the way who's been teaching in the schools. They're not taught about what happened with the Great Society, 60s, especially the aftermath in the 70s. They're not taught about what's happened in these other countries, the ugly results of these methods and these ideologies. So if you're not taught socialism, oh, okay, that sounds okay, better than having $100,000, $50,000, $20,000 of student debt. Yeah, that sounds pretty good. You don't know. So we have to do the counter ideas. And one of the things we have to learn is it's not just winning elections, important though that is. We got to learn to fight in the culture, fight in the schools, fight the battle of ideas, and make the case that what we're advocating gives you more freedom, more choice, more opportunity in life than what the others are offering.
I actually think, and you're preaching to my choir here, because I think the only way to connect with young people is upstream of politics, because the divisiveness of Republicans versus Democrats, conservatives versus progressives, this tribalism. I'm not sure that it's advantageous for us when we're trying to reach young people. I mean, President Trump has said this will never be a socialist country. And I'm reminded of, I'll pick on President Trump here for a second because I'm reminded of Frederick Hayek warning us that many of the critics of socialism didn't exactly understand what it was that they were criticizing. And if running against socialism and running against Bernie Sanders just becomes a talking point, I think you sort of lose that intellectual debate. And we've been picking on Democrats a lot, but I feel like there's some things that we should hold Republicans accountable for as well when it comes to expanding the size of government, the debt and spending, and even failing to make that strong argument for choice in healthcare as opposed to just criticizing Obamacare as socialist medicine.
Well, this is where the politics is important, because if we don't fight there, then bad things will happen. And one of the things that's happened over the last 100 years is the growth of the administrative state, whatever you want to call it. And these agencies, Congress will pass 120, 140 laws a year. These agencies will pass rules and regs that have the force of federal law 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 times a year, and crushing the economy. It's just so mind-boggling. Some estimate that it's 150 million words. And so that's also where we have to fight and make sure. I mean, we've seen already the benefits just of a little bit of deregulation, slowing this train down, and the benefits it has, especially for small businesses. And one of the things, and the way we fight those battles is not try to pick each little fight on each little regulation, but go through what a fellow named Philip Howard, who's probably a little left of center but hates what's happened to the law, principles-based regulation. Australia, a number of years ago, had hundreds of pages of regs on how you run a nursing home. They came up with a radical idea: throw those regs out. They came up with a few pages of 31 principles, like treat the patient nicely, keep the place clean, basic stuff like that, and said, you figure out how to do it, and if you don't, you'll be punished for it. You'll be held accountable. The results were amazing. Nursing homes became better. Patients were treated better. Principle-based, that's how we fight it. Instead of trying to fight these battles, which are like trench warfare, you gain ground, but it's a horrific cost, and then they counterattack. The empire always strikes back. So principles-based. One thing the Trump administration started is another idea. Why is everything concentrated in Washington? Why not have the agencies all around the country? The FDA, why not in Boston, where there's a great scientific community? Live among real people instead of this bubble in Washington, which makes lobbying harder too if it's spread around the 50 glorious states. Not so easy to go make a few calls and fix things. And so those kinds of ideas, which people say, yeah, it should be spread around the country. And one of the things Republicans keep making the mistake of is they always come across, and you alluded to it earlier, Matt, is taking something away, even if it doesn't affect you directly. If they can do it to him or her, maybe they can do it to me. Sort of this negative thing. So on Medicare for All, don't lead with the cost. That just goes over people's heads. Sounds like you're more worried about money than caring for grandma.
Right.
Start with less health care. They're going to take away your choices. They're going to make choices as to who gets the medicines and who doesn't. I don't want that.
Yeah.
Bad enough as it is.
So one of the, like, if you ask a free marketeer to grade the Trump administration, they will point to the Supreme Court. They will point to the tax bill. They will point to what looks to be a fairly aggressive administrative attempt to reduce the cost and the number of regulations, and I think you and I would agree that an incumbent president will be judged based on the economy, and all this other stuff perhaps doesn't matter nearly as much as we think it does. It's really about whether or not people feel like they're earning more, that they have more opportunity.
Key word is not only just earning more, but the chance to get ahead.
Yeah.
That there's a real optimistic future, which Reagan conveyed.
And From my perspective, you would have opinions about this and correct me, but I feel like the economy is not as strong as it should be. It's clearly stronger than it performed under the Obama administration.
It was significantly stronger in 2018.
Yeah.
Then we got involved in these trade disputes, and that has hurt. It's hurt manufacturing. It's hurt investment, because if you don't know what the rules of the road are, you're not going to invest as aggressively as you would have otherwise. And the thing to keep in mind is tariff is another word for sales tax. So when you hear 25% tariff on autos, think 25% sales tax. And it hurts us. Don't get the idea that, oh, somebody else is going to pay for it. No, we all pay for it. Consumers pay for it. Businesses pay for it. That gets to trade abuses. Well, there are mechanisms in place to deal with trade abuses. We've never really enforced them consistently. And if we need to reform the mechanisms to do it, as we did in the 1990s, perhaps 20 some odd years later, it's time to reboot it for the, reform it, change it for the digital age, then you do it. And we should, in the case of China, we should unite with our allies and say this kind of behavior is not acceptable. And by golly, that would have an impact. So if you're worried about abuses, that's one thing. But tariffs are not the way to treat abuses. And as for trade deficits, they're a little higher than they were a year and a half ago if you take that thing seriously, which ignores capital flows. That come to the United States. So it's an accounting artifact. But
it really is. I think these trade wars are very much the Trump administration's Achilles heel when it comes to what's going to happen in 2020. But it's difficult to argue with protectionists sometimes because it's not an economic argument. It's really an emotional argument that they make. But I don't know. We'll see. I don't see any backing down of the administration
where, again,
on this.
You have to prepare for the long fight. Studies are starting to show even the steel industry ended up not being helped very much at all by these sales taxes, and certainly hurt those who use steel. And so the Bush administration, Bush 43, tried some protectionism in the early days on steel. They saved some jobs there, at least short term, but cost 5 to 10 times as many jobs of those who use the steel.
Yeah, it was a disaster.
240 years after Adam Smith, 180 years after Britain repealed the Corn Laws, made themselves a free trade nation, 90 years after Smoot-Hawley, disastrous tariffs that started a global trade war and helped bring on the Great Depression. Here we are, still fighting those battles.
And by the way, the same way that Smoot-Hawley crushed the agricultural sector and triggered the Great Depression, that's part of what's happening now, is our farmers are getting hit pretty hard.
Yeah. Now, they're patriotic, and they say, well, if it's necessary to make America, well, we'll go through it short term. But they're going to start to ask, where does this end? And when the president said, and I'm being blunt here, when he said trade wars are easy to win, wars of any kind are not easy to win. They always take courses you don't anticipate.
Yeah.
And we're seeing that play out here, which is why I'm now optimistic that, seeing how difficult it is, I think we will get a deal with China, and so we can start to move forward. I think the Democrats will want to show they can get something done other than impeachment stuff in Washington, so they will pass the new NAFTA, USMCA, so we know what the rules are with Canada and Mexico. And then the key big thing to watch for is Europe. We've got actions potentially against their auto industry and other industries under what they call Section 232. Anyway, up to 25% sales taxes on autos and auto imports, given the fact these sophisticated supply chains around the world where things can cross the border several times before they go in the final product. You put that kind of a sales tax on, Europe's going to go into recession. They're already kind of wobbly right now. We'll go into a recession. Got to avoid that stuff. And if we avoid it, if you could wave the magic wand and have all these disputes go away, you'd see the market immediately go up 5,000 points on the Dow, and you'd see the economy go from 2% to 3% growth pretty quickly.
So I completely agree with your argument and your sort of macroeconomic analysis of the downside of trade wars, but it didn't get really personal to me until they slapped huge tariffs on Scotch whiskey, French wine, and cheese. Then I decided to really get upset about this.
Well, and you have probably felt it in other ways in terms of what you didn't get because of higher costs, what you missed in terms of greater economic opportunities because of these sales taxes and barriers. So yes, it can be direct and indirect, but we all pay for it.
So let's pivot and wrap up. I want to ask you. You are a publisher, and you were talking about technology earlier, and no industry has been as disrupted as publishing. Tell me what the future is for your industry, because getting knowledge to people and getting these ideas, and you write about this every day, making these basic economic arguments that we've talked about. How do you get to this place where everything is disrupted and disintermediated, and I'm sure you lie awake at nights asking yourself this question.
Well, Joseph Schumpeter, the famous Austrian economist, came up with the famous phrase, creative destruction. The creative part is very nice.
Yeah.
The destruction part, less so.
It smarts
Not
a little
nice.
bit, yeah.
And in our industry, the print industry, everything sometimes you felt you'd learn is going out the window. And so you have to remember what Peter Drucker, the late great management guru, once said. He said, every organization should remind itself, what is your purpose? What is it you're trying to achieve? What is it you're trying to do? And if you do that, then you become a little less discombobulated when the means to achieve it change. But where you talk about laying awake at night, and we live in an era where we can eat well or sleep well, but not both. Eating part I have no problem with. The other part, not so simple. But is that you don't know what will work in the future. There's no playbook. And you're inventing things as you go along. And it's quite hair-raising, and assuming you have hair. And the challenge is, though, come up with new ways of doing things. And one of the things we do now, we have in terms of we still print magazines, but online now we have over 3,000 contracted contributors. You're paid in part by the traffic you generate. So we're providing more content for people than ever before, but very different model. And we virtually
the
produce
Uber
a magazine.
of publishing.
Yeah, we do a virtual magazine every day now, over 100,000 submissions a year. And so, yes, you cannot stay still. The world is not staying still. And this also gets to the importance, you have to remind yourself of the importance of what they call branding. The internet will relentlessly commoditize everything. You have to have something that's truly distinct, where people can go to it and know what to expect and trust, then you have a chance. But it's nice to say, reinvent yourself. Much harder to do.
Yeah.
But that's what you're paid for. Consumers benefit, but those of us who provide it, it's
that may be a concept that few politicians really realize when they propose all of these schemes.
And they can't see the future. That's where socialism fails. Socialism cannot see the future. Planning. You can plan, but the world may change. Now, Hayek said one reason socialism fails is nobody in these positions has all the knowledge. Even if you had all the knowledge, go back 20 years. Could you have foreseen handhelds the way they evolved? The rise of things like Facebook or Google, services like that? No, you couldn't have. So you don't know until people do it. And if you don't have the environment where they can do it, you'll never know.
Let's leave it there. Thank you so much, Steve.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching Kibbe on Liberty. By now, you know this is the most important event of your week. So make sure you subscribe on YouTube. Click the little bell so you get notifications. Kibbe on Liberty, mostly honest conversations with mostly interesting people.